If you just lay down your tracks, you could have an airplane flying. If you bring your blue sky back, all you do is call me. I'll be anything you need. You could have a big difference going up and down all around the bends. You could have a mountain car pumping. There's amusement never ends. I wanna be the sledgehammer. Why don't you call my name? Let me be a sledgehammer. This will be my testimony. Show me round your fruit cage. 'Cause I will be your honeybee. Open up your fruit cage. Where that fruit is sweet as can be. I wanna be your sledgehammer. Why don't you call my name? You better call the sledgehammer. This will be my testimony. The sledgehammer. Let there be no doubt about it.
All right. We'll get going. Small group, but a good group. That's all we need. Can you hear my voice okay? Good stuff. John's here, Leanne's here, Brad's here. We might have some stragglers pop on. I didn't really advertise this one too much. I was kind of on the fence about doing a spring kind of set of this, but I thought, you know, what the heck, I think it's a good thing to do. And I'll be starting another course in later May, so we'll have 2 groups going concurrently and then others, so it's fun. Let's do it. It's a lot of stuff to talk about, so why not do it? So what I wanted to cover tonight, and John, some of this stuff will look familiar because I talked about it in general terms during our the winter session when we did one session on mainstreaming as a whole. Oh, we've got another person here. We talked about mainstreaming as a whole in the winter session, but this tonight is mostly it's going to be focused primarily on biodiversity into decision making. So mainstream biodiversity into decision making. This is supposed to be Spring 2018 Sustainable Development Lecture Series, May 1st. And why I chose to start with this is because I think it's probably the most important environmental issue on the planet right now. This is the big challenge, and I don't think it's given proper. It's not given the attention that it deserves. You know, seldom do you hear about this aside from those that work in the field. So we'll start this spring series with this topic, and then we'll get into some different details. So John, some of this will look familiar, especially when we talk about the policy stuff, but when I get down to the nuts and bolts of it, there's going to be some pretty distinct differences, more refined details. So first off, mainstreaming. So for those that you don't know what this word is, this is a word you got to know if you work in any form of policy analysis or environmental work that has any policy relevance whatsoever, or business as well. So mainstreaming it's kind of the hot word right now in environmental policy circles. You hear it a lot. If you go to any United Nations conference out there, you are going to see the word mainstreaming for sure. And if you go to any business and environment conference, you're going to see the word mainstreaming for sure. So say, for instance, WBCSD, this is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. That's got to be one of the biggest environment and business organizations in the world. They would for sure have a whole session on mainstreaming. So it's kind of the thing that's happening right now. It's the word people are using. So essentially what it means is taking the objectives of a policy instrument or an idea even, but mostly in this, what we're talking about, it's a sustainable development policy instrument, and applying them into a different area of decision making. So you could say, like, for instance, I said here, if we're talking about climate change adaptation, it means taking ideas and objectives that relate to adapting society to changing temperatures or higher climatic variability, and then introducing them into some sector or some practice. So we could say, well, we're mainstreaming climate change adaptation. That would mean taking the principles that relate to, say, higher climatic variability or the incidence of high energy storms, and then introducing the practices of dealing with that, say, for instance, becoming more resilient or using drought-tolerant crops into a specific area of practice. And I've listed agriculture. So agriculture would be, we would use drought-tolerant crops, or we'd be planting in areas that were less vulnerable to storms, that kind of thing. So mainstreaming, that's an important word to know. And this terminology is most often found in environmental policy. However, it may perhaps be present in other applications. Now, I can't speak to that because this is the stuff I work in mostly, but you could see that potentially in, say, poverty alleviation. You see it in SDGs and sustainable development goals, but I'd be curious to see if they use that same terminology in, say, refugee work or things like that. So where does this come from? It says who, why is this important, why do we care, and what are the implications? Those are the kind of the so what type of questions that we often ask ourselves when we're in a university environment, and quite often the answers we get are not good ones, meaning no one cares, it's not that important, and there are no implications. But that's not the case with this. It's actually really important, and there's a lot of people that care about it, and there's some pretty huge implications for it. So the United Nations is a group. I've seen this primarily at the UN as a start. So this is kind of where the nexus of the idea came from, at least the practice of using these terms and so forth, and continue to work on projects that have this theme. So they first encountered this idea of mainstreaming. This was in 2012 at Rio de Janeiro, at Rio +20. And it's probably been around a lot longer, but perhaps in different words. It has been in different ways of saying it. But that's where I first encountered it, was in Rio de Janeiro. And as you may learn, the business of policy is one of changing social, cultural, economic, and political circumstances. Always, it's like a moving target, and it's a culture unto itself, policy development, policy making. But it's also a culture of buzzwords. So there's a lot of terminology that goes along with this. Much like if you work in software development or technology, there's always new terminology. There's no different in sustainable development policy. So this is one of those words. Now, in order to have a good handle on these principles and actually make sense and mean anything concretely, it's best to follow the path from the general to specific. So we start with general policy to local implementation. And when we start general here, we're going to look more at the biodiversity topic, and then we're going to get to actual implementation in business. Okay, so in the case of implications to environmental management systems or environmental policy, we look at the implications on organizations such as businesses. So global environmental policy. So what is this, and why do we care about it? Well, this is an example. This is a shot taken from in September in Mongolia, where I was presenting at the UN conference for combating desertification. That's a tiny guy there. On the right-hand side, that's me. And these are all the other folks from the UN and Global Mechanism and so forth. So I was presenting there on some of the stuff that we work on. UNCBD is the UN Convention for Biodiversity. It's a convention for biological diversity. And this is one of the main things we're going to look at for this particular topic. UNCBD is it's an international convention, so meaning it's a framework, it's a legal framework that countries sign on to. So Canada is what we call a convention, or a party to the convention. So you say that someone is a party, a country is a party if they had signed on and they've agreed to that framework. So the Convention on Biological Diversity it's focused on conservation of biological diversity and sustainable and equitable use of resources, ecosystems. Very interesting organization. Personal favorite of the Rio Conventions. There's 3 Rio Conventions. One is the UN Convention for Biodiversity, one's for climate change, and one's for land degradation. They all started in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And that's the URL right there. And the Secretariat is located in Montreal. So these folks are good friends, and they're good people, and they are basically those that convene the convention. They manage the process of basically running how the convention works, all the research that goes into understanding the science that we need to understand for biodiversity conservation. But also they do a lot of logistical work by collaborating and coordinating with different countries that have signed on to this convention, and then regularly hold meetings. They're like the grand master of biodiversity conservation globally from a real rule standpoint. Okay, they're similar to the UNFCCC. That's the UNFCCC is the Climate Change Convention. Every 2 years they have a COP. It's a conference of the parties. The last one was in Cancun, Mexico. I was there, and that was where they go, and all the parties get together and they talk about policy implications and various different aspects of what biodiversity conservation is and how it should go, as well as negotiate. So D is presented both at COP10 and COP12. First one was in Nagoya, Japan. That was 2010, and then COP12 was in 2014 in Pyeongchang, Korea. So this is me and my team. I did the presentation, but it was the team's work. And mostly our role in these things is not to go and negotiate for a country necessarily, unless we're working for a country, but to go and present topics that relate to business and biodiversity. That's really where most of our interests and expertise lie. So there's various subgroups. They call them SUBSTA. Was one of them. The Subsidiary Body on Science, Technology, and Technical Advice, the SBI, is a Subsidiary Body on Implementation. Those are basically just little groups that focus on certain areas. So SUBSTA is more the scientists and engineers who work on reporting, monitoring, these kind of things. And they have members from the different countries participate in those panels, in those groups, and they work on protocols and collaborate a lot. It's quite interesting. It's a very big. There's I think 192 or some odd parties to the convention, so it's a big deal. So each party is required to produce specific reports. So every country needs to produce their biodiversity report. One of them is their biodiversity national report. They do NBSAPs, a National Biodiversity Action Plan. In addition, participation on specific sub-elements of the CBD. ABS is one, access and benefit sharing. So that's to do with sharing of genetic resources, like how do we dictate how genetic resources from a certain country should or should not be used. Is this going to be something that, since do we have to be careful about bioprospecting? This was a huge problem where you had companies go into, say, the Amazon and then try and attempt to patent different biological material, right, or use it without permission of the locals. So ABS came from that. The Cartagena Protocol is one for movement of living organisms, particularly, and there's also CITES, which is for endangered species. So there's a few different specific areas within the convention that different groups focus on. And you'll see that if you go to a COP, you'll see that they have their own little kind of area or their own little kind of time for doing discussions and presentations related to their interests, their focus. Lots of interest on the part of the private sector in terms of mainstreaming biodiversity into business. This is a big area where a lot of people are increasingly interested, and this is what we're going to talk about mostly tonight. I'll quickly spin over this because it's important to mention them. The SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals, similar type of policy framework, but very much more broad. So the SDGs are basically the new rendition of the Millennium Development Goals. It's a follow-up to the Millennium Development Goals. And MDGs were really focused, not completely, but very on core development, mostly on poverty alleviation. And quite a big success, I would say. Most people would say that. whereas the SDGs are more broadly related to sustainable development. And there's a lot of emphasis in the SDGs on climate change, biodiversity, ecosystems, and land degradation. So it's a little more broad and certainly more, and there's more environment in it. Hence, there's a lot of synergy with the Rio Convention. So there's a lot of connection between the Convention for Biodiversity and the SDGs. So mainstreaming climate action, another example of mainstreaming is climate change. So this would be the UNFCCC, so greenhouse gas objectives are set at the convention level. I'll just skip over this because we're not really going to go too much. I'm going to do a separate thing on climate change altogether. But same idea, you take climate policy and you mainstream it into decision making. I'll skip through this, boom, and get to this. So biodiversity in business is really what we want to talk about tonight. So why do we want to deal with biodiversity specifically? Well, first and foremost, we need to have some key definitions. First, biodiversity. Well, what is biodiversity, or biological diversity? So essentially, it's the variability among living organisms. It can be terrestrial, they can be marine, or they can be aquatic ecosystems in which these organisms live. It also includes diversity within the species themselves, and it includes diversity between species and diversity of ecosystems. So there's a lot of elements and different tiers, or I guess layers of diversity when you talk about biological diversity. There's genetic diversity, right? So it's not just about a bunch of different animals. There's a lot of different subcomponents to it. And this is exactly the type of thing that the science folks at the CBD work on. So ecosystem service, which is another important thing to understand, as it's related to what we're talking about. So it's a service that nature provides us. There's 4 categories of ecosystem services. Provisioning, so these are things like food and water provision. Regulating, so climate control, flood control, so forth. Cultural, so natural beauty, recreation, skiing would be something that would be provided to us from that cultural ecosystem services. And then supporting. And so supporting is basically, that is the bottom of the foundation of all ecosystem services. It's the basis for maintaining life. So like photosynthesis would be considered a supporting ecosystem service. So these services are really the basis of how our society and economy runs at the end of the day. Without these working properly, we don't have an economy. So this is from the Millennium Assessment in 2005. It outlines provisioning, regulating, cultural, supporting ecosystem services, and then how those relate to different constituents or elements of well-being. So for instance, health, strength, feeling well, access to clean air, that comes from a variety of different provisioning services, of course, because you get food and nourishment from ecosystems, but also regulating services, climate regulation, flood regulation, security, right? Basic material for good life, livelihood, so that comes from sufficient nutritious food, shelter, access to goods. All of those things, there's a direct mapping between ecosystem services and how we maintain a healthy society, both as individuals and as communities. So if you want to look further into this, go to the Millennium Assessment. It's really, the summary doc is good. Natural capital. So natural capital is the global stock of natural assets. So these are like geology, soil, air, water, and all living organisms are basically the core constituents of natural capital, serve as the basis for the provision of ecosystem services, and we can actually monitor the quality and quantity of these assets much like we do financial assets. Now, I'm not a type of person that is going to be like going and saying we need to commodify and value economically and monetize everything out there in nature. However, there are certain circumstances where we are utilizing natural resources and also polluting the environment and creating externalities that have no cost, right? So we're basically, it's a fire sale on certain natural resources and certain ecosystem services, and we're not paying the full cost or even a portion of it. And that's where we get into situations where we have degradation. And one of the best ways to control the use of a resource is to either create an incentive for not using it or a disincentive for using it. Risk. So there's many interpretations of risk. We need to define what we are concerned about first and foremost. So like loss of life would be one element of risk. Say, this is risky, I might die, right? In our case, what we are thinking of terms is more in terms of hazards to our organizations if we're talking about biodiversity in business. So there's two kind of general perspectives on risk. Quantitative risk assessment and then risk perception and communication. So one is far more on the quantitative side, like how do we quantify what's the probability of something happening. So I look at the top there, you see quantitative risk equals the probability of a hazard times the consequence of the hazard. So like in a flood case, you could say, well, it's a 1 in 100-year event, and if it does happen, then we're going to get tremendous loss of life or tremendous loss of capital assets, right? So you'd come up with a risk to that by looking at the probability of that occurrence and then what those impacts might be. And those consequences aren't exclusively financial. In fact, quite often we would look first and foremost at the impact on the environment or the impact on society, like the human cost of a disaster in terms of loss of life or injury. Risk perception, however, is quite a bit of a different thing. So risk perception is far more in the psychological realm of things, and it's basically how like Peter Sandman this is his model for risk perception, and it's a breakdown of outrage, so the degree to which people care about something, plus the actual hazard. So it actually doesn't have much to do with the consequence or the probability of that consequence or that hazard. This is the probability of the hazard or the consequence of the hazard has everything to do with what people think about something. You know, it's like it's not rational, is what I'm trying to say, and it's shown really in the data, in the work that Sandman has done. I would recommend taking a look at his work, Sandman. Resilience, another term. We started to look at that in our course so far. So this is like, it's a concept that's very important in the area we are now in. So we're in what we call the Anthropocene, which is the area, it's the time in geological history, it's, like Pleistocene and so forth, in which human activity is the most dominant force on the Earth system, as opposed to, say, glaciation or something like that. So based on system dynamics, it's the ability of a system to absorb a change in driving variables, state variables, and parameters and still persist. So that's the textbook definition of resilience from Buzz Halling in 1973. We want to foster resilient societies and organizations, those that persist despite disturbances and changes. So this comes back directly to what the focus of our topic tonight is, which is business and biodiversity. This is an important concept when we consider the changes to natural capital and ecosystem services that are occurring. The biophysical context. So that's a nice shot of the Earth, kind of eerie. So this is why do we care? So how many of you are familiar with the planetary boundaries model? You've seen this before. Say, raise your hand. I know some of you, if not all of you, have. Yeah, Brad, you've seen that. Okay, so if you haven't seen this, then I would recommend taking a look at this. This is from Will Steffen et al. In 2015, and it is a pretty good heuristic, I would call this. It's a heuristic that allows us to conceptualize and visualize what the status of the health of the Earth system is. And you can look at here, and this visual representation is based, there's a lot of aggregation of scientific data that goes into showing what's here. So, but they're showing it in a way that's kind of understandable. So if you look at here, it's a macro framework. It's a useful heuristic, and it's very useful for if you wanted to communicate these kind of issues to decision makers who may not have a scientific background or who are not working in this field. This is the one to use because everybody gets it. I've used this plenty of times, and pretty much everybody understands this when you show it to them, like a CEO or something like that. So if you look at this, you can see the different slices around the Earth system. This is what the Earth is there, and the radiance, like as you radiate out, those are safe operating boundaries, right? And if you look at that, you see these different slices, the wedges there, you have different things. So like land system change, stratospheric ozone depletion, novel entities, atmospheric aerosol loading, ocean acidification, biochemical flows or biogeochemical flows. All of those are different things that are vital to the health and operation of the Earth system. And what you're seeing with those different colors is a representation of where they stand in with respect to how concerned we should be, right? So if you look at that, you say, okay, well, climate change. So climate change is in the yellow zone. It's a zone of uncertainty, and it's approaching thresholds, and it's something definitely we should be concerned about. But if you look at some other factors on there, like, what is the graph? What is this graph called? Style. Oh, there's a name for it. Graph name. Just let me. I'll look that up and send it out. But, I mean, they use this a lot. If you look at the literature now, people are using. Looking it up right now. There's a name for it. No, that's all right. This is. I want to have people ask questions. It's supposed to be an interactive event. Okay. Yeah, radial charts. Yeah, radial charts. That's what they tend to call them. 209 best radial charts. So if you actually, I'm going to send this through. So this could be useful for you. Yeah, it's a radial chart. That's good. So if you could look at this one here, bang, that gives you a whole bunch of different types of radial charts. So you can look at that and look at where the red zones are, right? The red zones are not in climate change, and they are not in stratospheric ozone depletion or even land system change, although that's getting up there. It's in biodiversity, biosphere integrity, and biochemical flows. Those are two areas. Nitrogen and phosphorus loading of water bodies, and also just scarcity or availability of phosphates and nitrates is a big problem. It's a big one. So that's why you get a lot of attention being paid, more so to land degradation. It's loss of biodiversity. So there's two elements to biodiversity. Is genetic diversity. It's like the information bank of nature, and then diversity of functional traits of organisms in ecosystems. So genetic diversity tends to be measured in extinctions per million species. So a scale usually of 1 to 10 extinctions per million species years. So that's what you could see there in this graph here. They measure that in the number of extinctions. And look at the paper, Stefan All's paper, to get a little more background on specifically how you break that down. But it's a good metric. It's interesting to look at how they actually calculate that. Because when you think about it, you're looking at, oh well, how do we get at the loss of genetic diversity? And it's a tricky issue. So local studies of species loss for global figure. So this is not the type of thing where you can go out and measure all of the species in the world and then look at how they are changing over time. We just don't have, that's a tremendously huge job, and we've got to use proxies and estimates. So functional diversity is a biodiversity intactness index. It's the changes in population abundance as a result of human activities. So decent estimates are made regionally and locally, and then there's larger uncertainties globally with that. So you can do regional studies, for instance, on certain species of concern, and then extrapolate that to the global scene just to see how that might look like globally. So we have a framework where we can have some actual local studies that can tell us what's going on with biodiversity. We can then extrapolate those up to see how we're doing credibly, and then we have a heuristic to show us how we're doing with the planetary boundaries model or some similar type of heuristic. The question is then, who cares about this? We may care because we have some values that are in alignment with these kind of beliefs, but our job and what we need to do is make this really important and something that everybody needs to think about. We really need people who make very significant political and economic decisions to care about this stuff, right? So who would care about this? Well, this guy cares. Trump cares. And I use this, actually, I've borrowed some slides from this this presentation from a presentation I gave in Mexico City in November. I think, yeah, I think it was November. And it was to the Mexican Banking Association, and it was on biodiversity and risk and so forth. And I used this as almost a dramatic element. And when I showed that, I mean, just the eyes rolled. People like, what are you talking about? Well, and the reason why I use that is because he actually does care about this, because his interests are directly and deeply in alignment with this issue. Why? Not necessarily because he is a freakishly encouraging of biodiversity conservation or anything like that. His interests are in economic activity, as we know. So sincerely, he is concerned with disruption. Now, you could look at disruption in a lot of different ways, and he is a disruptor, and socially and all this kind of ways. But in his business and in his view of the world, economic disruption and negative economic disruption is not a good thing. So my argument is that he cares deeply about this issue because he cares deeply about warding off negatively disruptive economic disruptions. So this is where we start to look at what are the meat and potatoes of this, because when we look at risk and resilience and all these kind of concepts, we need to think about, particularly if we're working on this issue, how does that translate into how organizations work? So what are organizations concerned about? Like, well, in businesses, they're concerned about profitability, and they're concerned about reputation, and they're concerned about the welfare of their employees. They're concerned a lot of different things, the viability of their business. And the fact is, because of that red zone we're in with ecosystems and biodiversity, there is a heck of a lot of pressure on the natural resources that are sustaining and making viable many businesses out there. So therefore, we need to think about operations in this term. And we need data in order to do that. So biodiversity in business. All businesses are dependent on biodiversity and ecosystems. The question is, and we always have to ask this question, is how are they and why are they? So the challenge for any business when you talk about mainstreaming these ideas into their operation is to determine what their dependencies are. This is a step-by-step process of walking through the how you'd roll out a plan for a business. Number one, sort out what the dependencies are. So like you may be a water company, like obviously you're dependent on the water resource supply. Maybe you are an agriculture company, you're dependent on climate stability or climate commonality, like a climate that's predictable, and then the elements that help you grow your food. So that will vary between different organizations. You need to then analyze the risk and opportunity that they are confronted with. So every group needs to look at what risks and then what opportunities are presented to them. And then implement systems and strategies to manage those risks and capture the opportunities. So this kind of changing that we're seeing right now can present opportunities. It also can present risks, both of which need to be assessed and identified, and then you need data to then monitor and help you make decisions in light of that uncertainty. Dependencies, first and foremost. So this is what is a business dependent on. So workforce. So like if I am, say, this is for a bank in Mexico, our workforce is dependent on a healthy environment, provision of food, biophysical security, and the well-being of the workforce. So like if you're a Mexican bank, you want to make sure, or if you're a Bombardier or any organization like that, you want to make sure that you have a workforce that is secure, healthy, and productive. We're also dependent on the market, so we need customers. You can't sell stuff to nobody. You need people who are going to be consuming and want your stuff. So whether you are a B2C or a B2B or B2C, so business to business or business to consumer, everybody needs customers. That's kind of when I'm kind of collaborating with young entrepreneurs or meet them or something, that's one of the first things I look at. Is like, well, who are your customers? Like, well, what do you mean? I'm designing software, blah blah blah. It's like, no, you're doing something for someone at the end of the day. You're bringing value to someone, even if you're designing the next Facebook or whatever. There are people out there, and you need them. You need users. You need customers. So in this case, it's dependent on them. Like, you're dependent on the market, and the market then is dependent on biodiversity and ecosystem services. We're dependent on source materials, depending on the business. Could be we're making shoes or clothing, we need cotton. Could be minerals, we're making cell phones, we need rare earth minerals, metals, all that kind of stuff. So we need that. We need that stuff. This is how we map our dependencies. Operational support. We need to operate. So you need to work. Your plant needs to operate. And for that, you need energy, you need water, you need fresh air, you need all of these things that come from environmental services. So many of these dependencies are based very, very clearly and very directly on ecosystem services. And most ecosystem services, in one way or the other, are better functioning when we have vibrant and resilient biodiversity. So there's a connection between solid and vibrant biodiversity and the provision of ecosystem services that we require in order to operate. In terms of risks, so we have degradation of local biodiversity and ecosystems, can lead to an unproductive workforce, can lead to reduced productivity. A drought impacting a supply region, so that can lead to a reduce in supply and therefore a reduce in output. Like, say, again, back to the clothing issue. If we're reliant on cotton to make shirts or whatever we're making, and we have a drought in the region that's supplying us, then obviously we're going to have a problem with output. So you need to account for that and understand those risks. Inefficient use of biodiversity and ecosystems, so I say energy and water are two obvious ones, is going to lead to less productivity and higher costs, particularly higher costs when you have ecosystem valuation put in place. So if you're paying for water, for instance. So you want to have efficient use of resources. Acute disturbances from a disaster like a flood or a storm can cause business interruption. However, biodiversity and ecosystems can be used to help buffer that. And we encounter that in our work in agriculture in places like Trinidad and so forth, where you're going to get a storm. Like, there's no doubt about it. You're going to get storms. Whereas you can buffer against that by having healthy and vibrant biodiversity and ecosystems services operating. And then very public and visible impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems can have a profoundly negative impact on your reputation. We have some very, very good examples of that out there in the world. The opportunities, so those are the risks and the opportunities. Well, you can open up new markets where customers are seeking more environmentally responsible options, which is certainly a growing trend these days. Become more efficient through examining processes, so closed loop systems and so forth. Efficiency is by far the cheapest way of increasing productivity and dealing with some of these issues, like dealing with climate change as well. Having more stable supply of source materials and better relationships with suppliers is an opportunity that you can create. Increase reputational brand equity through proactive action with biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I've worked directly on projects like this where we have worked with an organization to build their basic street cred or their reputation based on really solid actions and projects. And as a result of that work, they just became, the hero company organization. It was an NGO. And they were able to attract funding much easier after that. It was pretty profound. And you can catalyze innovation in the organization through R&D focused on biodiversity and ecosystem related activities, and new materials, new processes, and then new strategies even. And last but not least, plain and simple, avoid losses. That's the best ways to manage capital is to not waste capital. And in this case, one of the best ways to conserve natural capital is to not deplete natural capital in the first place. Forget about restoration. First and foremost, avoid loss. So here's a bit of like system diagram type stuff, basic. So what is biodiversity and ecosystem service data, BES data? So there's direct and measurable BES metrics that can be employed. So you can actually like measure this stuff in an organizational context. Like the simplistic ones are things such as the use of water, the use of energy, consumption of natural raw materials, and you have basically your tally of how much of that stuff you're using. Use of raw materials. How many tons of cacao are you using on a quarterly or annual basis? So there are also measures of the stock of natural capital that has been used. So you have like your use of, say, water or whatever, but then you also have kind of the reservoir that's out there. So generally speaking, one has to determine what the system boundaries are when you're doing this kind of analysis. So let's just say that we are working for an organization. We're tasked, let's say it's Suncor, and we're going to look at, we want to look at the impact on biodiversity, like of their operations in northern Alberta. So we would want to model it to start with and look at, okay, well, what is the boundary of our system? Like, where do we draw the line? And then we do a little basic, well, much more complicated than this, but this is the general idea of looking at our organization, our operation, the business, and what comes into it. Like, what do we use? Water, energy, nitrogen, phosphorus, whatever it might be. In this case, we're using, in Suncor's case, we'd be using hydrocarbons as well, because we're going to be extracting them. Or actually, energy would be going in, and then the outputs would be the exporting of hydrocarbon-based energy products. And then what comes out? And then you just basically like draw this out, and then start to fill in all of the different factors from a biodiversity standpoint, an ecosystem service standpoint, that are impacting your operation, like that you are impacting. So it could be your sources, could be water to run your, say it's Levi's for dyeing and so forth, it could be energy, whatever, and could be sources for raw materials. Now there's a couple things here that I think are interesting to look at for reference. So the Natural Capital Protocol, this website here is the naturalcapitalcoalition.org. This is a framework for bringing natural capital into business decision making, and it walks through the questions like why, what, how, and what's next. And you can integrate that with other activities. So let's say if you're working on ISO 14000 or the GRI, for those like John who's taken that previous course in the EM Tools course, you can start to look at what's the overlap between natural capital and ISO 14000 implementation, right? And that's what these standards are good for. They're unto themselves, they tend to be very well established, but once you start to kind of deal with complicated situations, you're going to have to use different standards that specialize on different aspects of things. TEEB is another thing that I think is worth looking at. So TEEB for business, and John is familiar with this as well. It's the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity. So TEEB is an organization that provides standard valuation methods for ecosystem services and biodiversity. These are economic valuation methods. It's really useful in doing economic analysis of ecosystem services in a business. So if you wanted to look at, well, like what's the actual economic value of the water that we use on a day-to-day basis to produce genes, right? So TEEB is a framework that's invented by economists and bankers that can help you do that, and they've got an organization that does that. UNCIA, which is the what does it stand for again? Statistical and Environmental Accounting, Statistics of Environment and Economic Accounting, I believe, something like that. It's a UN-led initiative for providing standards and procedures for national level accounting of environmental factors. It complements TEEB and the Natural Capital Protocol and WAVES, but it's a national level framework for doing environmental accounting. WAVES, below that, is called Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services. This is from the World Bank, and it's a country-level policy information for accounting and valuation of environmental services. That's used to align with business activities, like sharing data and standard formats and so forth. And it's just one of those things that the World Bank is pushing as something they want to see used by different countries that are either clients, they're borrowing money, or they're recipients of grants and so forth. So, proof. These are conceptually legitimate things and they exist, but does anybody really do this stuff? That's the question. Well, there's a few that I'm going to talk about. And the first one is Faber-Castell. So Faber-Castell, you may remember Faber-Castell from back in your childhood. At least for me, I remember Faber-Castell from then, when I would get HB pencils, or 2B or whatever, different softnesses of graphite, and then do whatever, sketching or stuff like that. And you would make the pencils, right? Faber-Castell is a pencil making company. It's one of the oldest family-run companies in the world, Faber-Castell. I was not aware of this when I came across them as an adult. And they are responsible for safeguarding raw material through afforestation in southeastern Brazil. So they are big into conservation of rainforests and then regeneration of forests, because one of their main things is they're using wood to make their pencils, but they seem to be doing it sustainably. So they've planted about 10,000 hectares of trees, and they left about 2,700 hectares as wildland, rangeland, whatever. They have a forestation project in Colombia, recognized as one of the first CDM projects registered with the UN. So a CDM project is a clean development mechanism, and that was something that was kind of created in the UN system to help to create offset projects. So CDM, you can do a CDM project for forestry, you can do a CDM project for creating an energy, alternative energy power plant or whatever. It's basically a CDM is a clean development mechanism, and what it's promoting development that is carbon friendly or carbon neutral. So you could do, like in this case, they're talking about forestry, because they're by saving trees or not chopping them down, you're reducing greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere. But in addition to that, there's also other initiatives that happen within CDM, like energy switching. So let's say if you have a school here and they're on an oil furnace, you could propose to them, well, maybe not here in Canada, but let's say if it was in a developing world context, you could propose to them, well, we're going to change your energy generation system to solar, and then we're going to realize greenhouse gas benefits as a result and create offsets from that. It's the difference in what you've saved as a result of a green choice in policy or technology. There's been some investment in biodiversity and ecosystems. Like Faber-Castell has. They have a strong eco-efficiency program and the stable supply of their source materials as a result of some of the things that they have chosen to do with communities and so forth. They manage the risks quite well. Company 2. So the second company I want to talk about is Mars. Okay, Mars Incorporated, not the planet. So Mars is one of the biggest privately held companies around. So it's a family company, and they make all kinds of different consumer products. They're a B2C company, business consumer. They take things, they make things, and then they sell them. So you will know Mars products from going to any grocery store. They have something called Sustainable in a Generation Plan, and it involves a healthy planet, so climate friendliness, water use, land use, and waste. Thriving people, so thriving incomes, human rights, women's rights, and then nourishing well-being, so food safety and security, improving products, and responsible marketing. So those are like the core elements of their sustainability program. So if you look at the slide here, you can see when I say you will have seen these products in the grocery store, because is there anybody here on this call who has not seen at least one of those logos? Either like on the internet or anywhere. There's one that's anybody that doesn't recognize anything. I have to ask because you never know. The point here is they are all over them. They're all over the place. They've got M&Ms, they've got Starburst, they got Pedigree, they got Uncle Ben's, Dove soap, Twix, Milky Way, Skittles. Dog food and Snickers. Yes, they do. So they have a whole pet division. So they do, I don't know, where's dog food? Snickers, where's the Snickers? Oh, pedigree. Ah, yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. Dog food. That's dog food. And then Whiskas, Royal Canine. Yeah. So they have a whole pet food part of their company, and I'm hoping they don't use the same machines for sorting the Snickers bars that they do for sorting, the Whiskas and the pedigree. Yeah, that's kind of disgusting, but yes, protein is you betcha. We're too politically correct. If it's good enough for cats, it's good enough for dogs. It's good enough for us. So these folks, funny story. Like I knew nothing about this company until 2010 when I was at the COP conference for biodiversity at a side event, which is where the interesting things happen. I'll get talks and stuff, not on the negotiations. And I was watching presentations on business and biodiversity because I was new to that, and I was like, "Wow, this is kind of cool. This is interesting." And they had a panel up there, and then they had a variety of speakers, and they actually looked very stereotypical. This is an international conference, so you have these guys from a company called Natura, which is a Brazilian company. They do like health products and so forth. They were there, and they looked Brazilian. It's like, okay, those guys look Brazilian. And they had someone from Volkswagen, and he looked German, Volkswagen. And then they had a couple guys from a Japanese bank, and they just looked like Japanese bankers. And then at the end of the table, they had a crazy-looking guy with long white hair and a big bushy beard and mustache. And he had a sign there in front of him on the table that said Mars. And I was sitting next to someone, and I thought, what is that? Like, I don't get it. That guy's from Mars. Like, is he? I just assumed that he was from some small NGO that he probably ran called Mars, and they do, I don't know, crazy things because he looked kind of wacky. But then he got up to speak, and he says, well, you may know us less as a company, but more for our products that we produce. And the next slide in his PowerPoint was like kind of a shooting where the logo comes popping out of all their products. And this is just a sample of all the stuff they make. They make a ton of stuff, and I just was blown away by the scope of what they do. So, yeah, they do a lot of stuff. So one of their big things, though, is they have a very, very big emphasis on science. So Shapiro, Robert Shapiro, Howard Yana Shapiro is the name of their guy who ran their biodiversity program. Brilliant guy, and he's big into science. He really sees that as fundamental. But what they look at is their footprint. So they don't want to just stop at their system boundaries and say, okay, well, our company is this, and then we're going to take care of everything within that. They view their supply chain as part of their responsibility. So they've got this sustainable sourcing plan. They've got very clear deforestation policies for stuff they source: cattle, soy, and grains and cacao and any raw materials that they need that could potentially have a pretty significant ecological impact. They've got a good plan for managing that in place, and they're very upfront about it. The third company is Puma. So you may have heard me say stuff about Puma before, but I like to mention them just because I think they do a good job and they're bold and visionary. At least they have been. They initiated an environmental profit and loss account, an EPL, first in 2011, and then subsequently from that. They've done one in 2012 and 2013. And the idea at the time was to quantify and economically the use of environmental factors in their production. They wanted to know what is the economic cost of the amount of water that we use in what we do. And the idea there is to then look at, okay, that's a real cost. How do we minimize those costs and those impacts? But you have to measure it. So due to the strategic benefit they gained, they are doing it group-wide. So they started Puma first, but they're part of a larger group called the Caring Group, C-E-R-I-N-G. and they are now pushing their environmental profit and loss account through their whole organization, which is kind of exciting. So in 2012, when I met the CEO of Puma, I was at Rio de Janeiro at Rio Plus 20. It was a business thing, and he's a relatively nice guy. I mean, fair guy, I'd say. And I kind of, we were talking, and then I just said, look, well, why do you do this? Like, why are you doing this? What benefit is it to, your organization? And his one phrase answer was risk management. It wasn't about, I want to save the trees, or I want to do this, that, the other thing. Is about, we're doing this to better manage our risks, which I kind of found was refreshing at these conferences, where someone comes out and just says, like, tells it how it is, instead of this kind of global diatribe about this, that, and the other thing. So their EPL is something that they calculate the economic values for, and then they publish it. So they put it out there on, I think, an annual basis, maybe more frequently. I'm not sure. I have to double check. But it's an interesting document, because they don't necessarily get down on themselves if they have, like, they've discovered a lot of economic cost to a certain aspect of their operation. But what I found is that it's a very revealing process in implementing something like that, because it forces you to think about really what you need to use in order to kind of realize something. So the strategic importance. What is the importance of this? So environmental change, for one, is here to stay. Like we had this conversation before about variable climate, snowing, sunny, rainy, whatever. So change is going to be relatively consistent, and something that we need to deal with. So we are now in the era of nonlinear dynamic environmental change. So a lot of things happening at the same time, both socially, economically, and environmentally. And there's a lot of nonlinearity. So we need to kind of be ready for what we encounter. And businesses tend not to be, right? A lot of them are dependent on biodiversity and ecosystems in a very significant way, particularly agriculture companies, and they are in no way, shape, or form, in no way are they really kind of functionally resilient. So we need to use a systematic approach. We need data, we need some creativity, and these combined will bring innovation and will bring value. So we need some form of business evolution, and I would argue we need a form of a biodiversity revolution. We need to look at what we're doing at the organization level, even if you're working at a university or working in a company or working in municipal government or whatever it might be. Look at and ask the question, are we mainstreaming biodiversity into our operations? Because you have all the information here now. Like, you have this to work with. And this can be as legitimate, and it can paint a very, very powerful picture for those that are trying to affect change positively. So yeah, that's it. So mapping out the sources of and dependencies on biodiversity is the first step, and then rolling that through as you proceed to see where are you vulnerable, where are your gains, where are your potential losses, and then how can you then translate those ideas into some sort of actionable elements. This is where things at the UN get kind of fall down quite a bit, is they are not as actionable as they could be with certain initiatives. Like, I mean, on the ground actionable, and it's part of the reason why is because they're not designed to do that, except for like UNDP, the development program. But at the convention level, most certainly, like, it's very kind of, here's the framework, and let's kind of look at the science and discuss it, and we'll come up with the best solution. Whereas groups like the UNDP and so forth, they're out like, okay, well, here's the problem, we got to go there and sort this out and monitor it this way, and so forth and so on. So it's kind of a different culture. So that's it for me. Now, why I think this is important is because it's not widely talked about, yet it's hugely important. And when you get in a situation like that, that's where creeper issues become huge real quickly, is when you know that an issue is there and it needs to be addressed, and people are not addressing it in a way that adequately kind of helps to move it in a positive direction, because that just boils and boils and boils, and it evolves, and people get concerned, and then enough people get concerned, they start to do stuff, and then they start to look at, okay, well, how can we design some technology to deal with, how can we protest against this company, how can we whatever, and how can we mainstream that in a variety of different ways. So I swear to you that this topic, biodiversity and ecosystems, is very important, and something that we should think about, and also think about in a practical sense, because this is where opportunities will lie for you guys and for everybody. So does anybody have any questions? No questions? Okay, no worries, Brian. We're going to do the same thing for spring. Every Tuesday at 7 p.m. I will put out the word a bit more, and I'm going to adapt it a bit. I'm going to make it a bit tighter, maybe even bring in some other folks. I think that'd be fun. I've highlighted in here, just going to go to that slide. Mars is a good one to look at. They're a big company, so it's like, whereas Faber-Castell is much smaller. Let's about get the link for future sessions. Future sessions, I will probably, I'll do for sure Twitter. I'll do Instagram, and maybe even I'll do an email out, just create a group, something like that. I'll make sure it's available. That's going to be the same link, but I will it just reminds people of it. So I got to do a better job of promotions. I'm not very good at that. Or get someone to help me out. This here, I think, is what to look at. Going back. Do each of these standards have their own auditing? Yes. They only have people like TEEB, for instance. TEEB, I kind of have to think about that. So TEEB is the framework, but you typically get people that have worked with it to do the implementation. And then I think you can get that audited by like PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, is really up to speed on this stuff. They're impressive. Like PwC is an impressive. I normally am like, yeah, management consulting, management companies, not so much. Pretty boring sustainability, you know, carbon accounting, and just nothing like, whoa, my gosh, like. However, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, of those companies, is definitely has been one of the ones that's been doing some pretty progressive stuff. So they would have audit capability at that organization. Whereas the other ones, Natural Capital Protocol, like the Natural Capital Protocol, Coalition, Waves, I don't think so. That's more of like something that's provided, and then an organization that kind of, you know, that exists. Waves, for instance, they have, you know, presumably an office at the World Bank, something like that, where people work on it, and then they're a resource person for Waves that may be applied in various different bank projects. But it tends not to be as structured as, say, like an ISO 14000 type of thing, or you know, it's a little less constrained. ISO 14000, boom, you do this, 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 this. Whereas these have a little more nuance to them in some cases. It depends on the industry too. I was going back here. Where is it? There. So in this slide, you can see the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity. That would be good to check out. That is located on the UN Convention for Biological Diversity website, UNCBD. UNCBD, well, UN period. No, actually, UNCBD is all one word. www.uncbd.com will take you to .ca, something like that. Will take you to them. Go to the Global Partnership for Business and Biodiversity. There's a lot of good information, resource information there. Case studies and stuff like that. Any other questions? Although natural capital and such are a great mechanism to raise awareness in the supply chain, I'm still concerned about the day when the dollar rewards outweigh the environmental risks. Example, loss of croplands for biofuels in the U.S. Yeah, when the rewards outweigh the environmental risks. Oh, conservation reserve program. Okay, so like when the benefits of the use of environmental services outweigh the conservation benefits. Yeah, like when you can potentially make more money than you can from conserving.
Yeah, I guess what I was kind of getting at with the conservation reserve program lands, landowners were basically paid to set aside
because
lands.
you monetize something. Like in this case,
Yeah.
it's biofuel. I'm concerned about that as well. I don't think valuations is the number one thing. Let's look at the coastal zone of BC, right? So this is a good example. Like I'm concerned about this coastal zone of BC issue with the Kinder Morgan pipeline because the dollar rewards for oil and gas ancillary. I was reading the Globe today, and Justin Trudeau was saying at a conference here in Vancouver that, oh, well, if we get the pipeline done, your gas is going to get cheaper. May get cheaper, which is just, for one, there's not a direct correlation between those two things. They're not. It's like the issue is far more complicated. There's far more variables contribute to gas price than the supply of crude to the Lower Mainland. There's a lot of different things that are working there, and that there's no reason to think that having the pipeline come in is going to immediately result in gas prices dropping. But the idea there is the economic benefits, i.e. saving on gas, or then the gains from selling diluted bitumen to offshore countries like China or Asia or whatever, wherever there, is going to then, like we've done the economic calculation for that. We know potentially how many barrels of oil will be shipped per day, and what some estimated price would be for that over even through market fluctuations and so forth. But what we haven't calculated is what is the economic value of the environmental services where these tankers are going to be traveling, right? We haven't done that, and so there's zero way of doing like a risk analysis to say, well, okay, well, this is great, we can make all this money doing this, but even just purely economically, never mind climate change and all that kind of stuff, just purely based on industry, if we have an oil spill, our tourism industry, which is worth this amount per quarter or what have you, is going to essentially be cut by 75%, right, or more, whatever the figure is that you come up with. This is where I think it's useful, because when we bring some sort of pricing signal or economic value to the invisible, the things that we rely on yet we don't account for, then we can have a more informed discussion about the costs and benefits of projects that in some cases we view as being beneficial. In other cases, if we look at it in that way, we can say, well, geez, it doesn't make sense. Like we'll have all these impacts, which fisheries and this, that, and the other thing. But if we don't have like kind of a framework for doing that, then I don't think we have a really strong argument to make. Now, your point though, if we go to look at conservation issues, there are there are times where we have to look at just the willingness to pay, which is the willingness to pay is a common metric for that used in economics for assessing the economic value of something. So what's the willingness to pay for, I don't know, going to a park? Like, how much are you willing to pay to ensure that this park gets conserved, right? And this is something you can establish through doing a survey or something like that, or use proxy variables like, you know, visits to natural park, like how much do people pay on an annual basis or something like that. That could be extrapolated from willingness to pay. That's where we can get into kind of, you know, more of the conservation side of things. But I don't think, I mean, there are some cases where we shouldn't even venture to do that calculation. It's just a no-go zone. It's just something, certain things we should not kind of take that risk, or we should not deplete those resources. And more I lean towards that school of thought the older I get. Any other questions? There's some really good examples of this, and I'll send you some, just make a note here. Conservation versus, it's definitely a philosophical issue, you know, like if you really get down to the bottom of it, go read Henry David Thoreau, Walden, and then read some Alan Drankson, philosophy. Alan Drankson's the ecosopher from UVic, actually, who I believe is the founder of Ecosophy Tea. I think he came up with that. I think maybe it could have been Arne Ness. I could have been Arne Ness. But Drankson's great. Like, Drankson's done a lot of work in that area. Read that, and then, or Aldo Leopold, same thing. I mean, this is a debate between Aldo Leopold and Guilford Pinchot, right? If you want to look at, say, early to mid 1900s United States environmental policy. Aldo Leopold, the land ethic, conservation first. Guilford Pinchot, similar conservation-ish perspective, but sustainable use, right? Let's use this on a sustainable basis. You know, then you're always going to get that debate between those two schools of thoughts, and those that are just adamantly opposed to, don't believe in economic valuation. They just fundamentally don't believe that you should put that price on it. I myself am more pragmatic. John Muir, there's another one. So, I mean, I love that stuff, you know, and I'm actually kind of working on that stuff right now. But there does come a point in time where we have to, like, just be practical about it, because some people just don't have that same mentality, and we have to kind of we have to navigate those waters from a policy and regulatory standpoint. Any other questions? Good questions. I like this. I want more of this. Next week, gotta get everybody out. I'll send another. I'll be like doing a lead up to next week, and I'll come up with a really good topic. I'll be driving back from Nelson next week, so I've got to make sure I get back in time. So, all right, cool. All right, folks, we'll wrap it up. Just under an hour, or just over. I will do a schedule with the topics. Yeah, I'll do that. I mean, yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'll put an effort into promoting a bit more, and I will put an effort into, like, jazzing it up a bit. I don't want to make it too academic. But I mean, this is the stuff we work on, right? So we gotta, like, you know, we gotta work on this stuff. Can't make it diluted too much. I'll see if Dane wants to come on. He's my lawyer. He's a guy who works on environmental law. Good dude. He does some interesting things to add. And there's some other folks. All right, well, thank you very much for coming out. I'm glad that we started this session end this series on a good note. And we will close with the same genre. Who is this? It's an easy one.
I get so lost sometimes.
No, close. You came late, so you missed it. Close up. In fact, they're like they used to be together, like performing. Yeah, Peter Gabriel. Yeah, well, Genesis was Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins originally. He is amazing. Peter Gabriel is like a hero.
All my instincts, they return.
I hope someday to do something with that guy. I don't know what. Night. And if you want good music, go get the soundtrack to The Passion, which is produced by Peter Gabriel. Passion, excellent CD.
Oh, I see the light and the heat. Oh, I wanna be that complete. I wanna touch the light, the heat I see in your eyes. I don't like to see so much pain, so much wasted, and this moment keeps slipping away. I get so tired, working so hard, for I survive. I look to the time of you to keep me awake and alive. And all my instincts, they return, and the grand facade so soon will burn without a